Okay, we have a treat today. Two speakers, Jeff Vincent and Liz Jain, both from the Center for Cities and Schools here at UC Berkeley. Jeff is the Deputy Director and co-founder of the center, and Liz is a graduate student researcher there and a candidate for a Master of Public Policy at the UC Berkeley Goldman School for Public Policy. Liz has been a senior associate at Pew Charitable Trusts in Washington, D.C. She's worked at the state level on budget management strategies, including efforts to develop equitable systems for education finance. Jeff received his master's from UC Berkeley in city and regional planning. Before that, he was at the University of Nebraska, where he received both his MCRP in community and regional planning and his BA, BA in anthropology and environmental studies. Jeff is also a researcher with Building Educational Success Together, a national collaborative providing research and resources to improve public school facilities. The Center for Cities and Schools provides both policy research and technical assistance in cultivating collaboration between city and school leaders. One of its goals is to promote high-quality education as an essential part of urban and metropolitan vitality, equitability, health, and sustainability. Thank you for being here.
Great, thanks. Well, hi everyone. Maybe I'll stand, is that going to be okay? So Liz and I wanted to present on our latest study on school facilities. We actually released it today. EdSource has a nice article on it today. So there's some interest in this issue about school facilities funding in California, and so we're going to give the context of that, of what's going on, and kind of a big policy debate, and so really the study is meant to inform that. So we're really curious, kind of your perspectives on this in the ed school, if you guys talk about facility conditions, facility funding, and overall physical environment conditions as you're thinking about ed policies. It's something that we think about a lot. So the study is going it alone. Can California's K-12 school districts adequately and equitably fund school facilities? So here's the punchline. If you remember nothing, it's this. What we find is that there's an ongoing structural pattern of underinvestment in K-12 public school facilities across California. And that underinvestment harms student health and achievement, and it's inconsistent with the equity priorities of the local control funding formula. So that's the punchline. So how did we come to that conclusion? Next, yeah, go ahead. So here are the key findings, and Liz is going to go into these in more detail, but just to give you the broad stroke, is basically the majority of school districts in California underspend on their facilities. And wealthy districts spend more on facilities, especially on the capital side. And we'll talk about this in a second, but essentially if you're a school district and you're going to spend on your facilities, right, you spend from two budgets. Your general operating budget, which is what you pay teachers and buy textbooks, et cetera, do everything with, et cetera, right? But then there's your capital budget. Your capital budget is really what goes into the hard bricks and mortar. It's new construction, it's additions, it's big renovations or modernizations, right? So that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about facilities funding. So what we find is that wealthier districts spend more on facilities, especially on that capital side. And we'll come back to that. And then lastly, districts that are serving more low-income students spend more per student on maintenance and operations from their operating budgets than districts that serve much fewer low-income students. So what that means is, if you're a district with a greater share of low-income students, you're having to spend more on your facilities, on maintenance and operations, than other districts. So you're sort of taking money out of the classroom, so to speak, right? That burden is greater for you than wealthier districts, and we'll show you how we come to that conclusion. But the point being is that this is sort of very inconsistent with the efforts made in the local control funding formula around equity and providing more funding for lower income students or the specific targeted disadvantaged students. So,
sorry.
Yeah.
Just a quick clarifying question. When you say they underspend, do you mean they spend less than their facilities need, or in their budget they portion things out in a not...
Less than their facilities need.
Okay.
So what we have done in the study is try to understand what do facilities need across the state. And I'll tell you why that is so important is because there is no state money for that right now. there's a big debate among the legislature and the governor whether or not the state is going to step forward again and provide capital funding to districts. And I'll explain that in more detail in a second, but it's around need. And so this has been the big unknown, is what is the need. No one has been able to quantify that or pinpoint that in order to really understand the scale of needs across the state. So, next. All right, so very quickly before I jump into it, the Center for Cities and Schools. We are a policy research center here at Berkeley. We were actually founded about 10 years ago between the Graduate School of Education and the Department of City and Regional Planning, which is all the way on the other side of campus in Worcester Hall. And I myself have a PhD in urban planning, but I did a kind of minor emphasis in urban education. And my partner in this effort is Deborah McCoy, who did her PhD over here in the Graduate School of Education. And so most of our work is done with and for public agencies. We do a lot of work with school districts and cities around the Bay Area, and we do a lot of state government work. But really around how do you make strong cities that have successful young people? And really those two are very connected. You know, a good neighborhood and a good school often go hand in hand. And so we do a lot of work on the so-called out-of-school factors, these things that are outside of school hours that affect young people. And so there's a whole host of issues that, you know, create obstacles for families and young people or create sort of ladders of opportunity, right? And a lot of those are related to stable and affordable housing, transportation access, the health of their communities, the safety of their communities. And so many of those are community development, land use issues. So how do you get school districts and cities to work together to make child-friendly places? And so we do, you may have heard of one of the programs that we run, which is called Y-Plan. It's a methodology for engaging young people in schools in city making and city redevelopment. And we work in a lot of schools, high schools around the Bay Area. Now we're working across the country. And it's really getting high school students to study their communities, and we have clients who are developers, who are cities or transit agencies that are doing real projects, real redevelopment projects, and they get the young people then study that project, they study the needs of that community, and then they present to city council, school board, developer, whoever the client is. Right? And so we do the Y Plan, and then we run a program called the Plus Leadership Initiative, which is really the adults in that equation need to know how to work together, and they need to know how to take young people's opinions and ideas as legitimate stakeholders in the community change process. And so that's our Plus Leadership Initiative, where we work with our city school teams around the Bay Area to do that. We've done transit village redesign, we've done mixed income housing, we've done school campus redesign, something that there's always kind of a built environment, brick and mortar component to it. But we've done a lot of work on school facilities, particularly from a policies perspective. And you know, the research is pretty good now. We know that if children sit in really poor quality environments, it harms their health, it harms their education, it gets in the way of teaching and learning. There's higher teacher absences when you have poor indoor air quality and other very poor factors. There's higher student absences, and those things have been correlated with lower student achievement. And we know, unfortunately, that minorities and low-income children are much more likely to sit in very poor condition facilities. The problem that we have is that we know that these poor facility problems are spread across the state, and of course every state is dealing with this, and we have a lot of anecdotal evidence around that, but we don't know exactly how many students sit in these classrooms, exactly the quality of these classrooms. We don't have a statewide inventory of buildings, their conditions, et cetera. And this poses a really huge problem on the public policy side. How do you target, as a state, how do you target investments to where they're most needed, right? So, okay, that's enough about us. Here's our URL, and you can get this study going in alone is up as a PDF on our site. So, go ahead. All right, so what do we want to talk about today? We want to talk about the policy context and what we found in this study and kind of why it's of importance right now. So, we'll talk about first I'll talk about the California policy debate that's happening on this right now. And I'd be curious if any of you are, have been observing this at all. And then we'll talk about how have we been calculating minimum spending needs, to your question, right? Because this has been a big unknown. And so what we've done is introduce methodology to do that. And then, okay, what did we find? Our findings, and from that, the policy reforms. So, yeah, go ahead. So kind of the backstory is that there's a big, LCFF happened, right? Huge, like watershed shift to a more equitable funding approach from the state of California, but on the program side, right? And that's usually what we talk about. But on the capital side, there's this whole other thing going on funding school facilities, and it's a lot of money. So what we're seeing is the shifting funding context where the governor is saying there's going to be less state funding for school construction, school renovation and repairs, and he wants there to be more reliance on local funds. And so what's been happening, so this shows you, we did a study a couple of years ago looking at kind of all the money that had been spent, where it had gone, and kind of what was needed. And so if you look at what's been spent, there's been, we calculated this was up to 2011, which, you add a few billion onto that, but, basically like $120 billion been spent over about 13 or 14 years on school renovation and new school construction. And you can see how this breaks down, whereas 35 billion of it comes from state bonds, right? So these are, as voters, we vote on these, and then those bonds are statewide, and we've basically had 4 state bonds since 1998. And you can see they're roughly in the 6 to 10 billion range usually. It's a significant amount of money. And these bonds set up what's known as the SFP, or the School Facility Program. And school districts apply for funding from the state based on a modernization project. That's the term that's used for like renovating a room or a set of rooms or a whole building, or the new construction program. And there's other funds in there for charter schools and other things, but mainly it's the modernization program and the new construction program. So while the state's been put up about 35 billion, local school districts have also been passing their own bonds. Voters in those districts are voting for bonds, and so you can see the vast majority of this funding is locals doing it, right? And then developers, if they're building new houses, they pay development fees on those, and those go towards new school construction pretty much, because new homes, new children, which translate into new needed seats, right? And then there also at the top there was what was called a deferred maintenance program that the state was providing a couple of $1 billion into to match with local monies. And this was basically meant as a way to kind of catch up, for districts to catch up on the deferred maintenance that they had. Basically the things that they had not repaired over the years, right? And one of the reasons that the school facility program was set up, and the state had been funding school construction and renovation before that, but not to levels like this at all. And pretty much the reason that the school facility program was set up was because we had enormous enrollment growth through the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. I mean, we roughly had 20% enrollment growth, right? And so you've probably heard stories of places like Los Angeles Unified, huge overcrowding issues, busing children across to the west side, et cetera, an hour-plus bus rides. And so a lot of this money went towards new construction. And in some places it was catching up on the, what we hadn't built with all that overcrowding, because we had a lot of immigration, we had a lot of just overall enrollment growth, particularly in some of these neighborhoods that weren't seeing development per se, new housing that might go to new construction. I mean, there was certainly some of that. We had enormous suburban growth over this time too. Lots of growth, a lot of that, probably half of that money or so went towards new construction, the other half more or less went towards renovating existing schools. And the way the program is set up is that school districts basically apply. If they qualify based on their students or the age of their building, they apply for funds in those programs. And they're set up roughly on a 50-50 match, where state funds contribute to local funds. So, go ahead. And so actually I should say, though, before we get to this, is that right now there is no more money in the school facility program. And the governor has said in his last couple of budgets that now is not the time to be spending money on school facilities, particularly because that is debt-driven money, right? The state is taking on debt with those bonds that it must repay over time, just like if you would, say, buy a house, for example. And so, right, as of about a year and a half or so ago, 2 years ago now, I guess there hasn't been any school construction funds. And so school districts are really scrambling. We went from basically more or less a 50-50 contribution from the state for renovations and new construction, and now we're basically at zero. And so this is really a shock to the system, right? And school districts are really struggling with how are they going to do this. So And then what you see too with the LCFF is that if you look at the template for the LCAP's local control and accountability plans, there's actually a mention of facility conditions in there. This is actually, in my view, this is kind of one of the first times that facility conditions has been more sort of formalized into kind of the way in which the operating funding goes out and the accountability around that. And if, as you all know, the state has set up these 8 priorities, and of course, the first priority is basic necessities, which are 3 things: qualified and properly assigned teachers, sufficient instructional materials, and facilities in good repair. And so the question is, how are districts going to meet all of those things? And those of you familiar with the Williams lawsuit back in 2005, these are basically the 3 complaints in the Williams lawsuit. The teachers issued instructional materials and facilities in good repair. Those found their way into the state priorities. And so in districts' LCAPs, they are supposed to articulate, and with their budget, the degree to which school facilities are maintained in good repair is specified in the Ed Code. And the Education Code in California has a definition of good repair. But, the ACLU, these graphics are from ACLU, which I thought, if you haven't seen these, they're fantastic. They are the best thing in one page that has described both the LCFF and the LCAP, and I often share them. So kudos to the ACLU. But their analysis of the first round of LCAPs found that I think it was almost 40% of districts really did not address school facilities in good repair at all in their LCAP. So it's kind of been this, I don't know if it's forgotten or it's just not been addressed. And I think that, so I think it's an issue that needs to be addressed across the state. Districts vary in their kind of ability and sophistication in terms of being able to do that. And of course, this is all predicated on parent participation, and I think that facility issues and the technicality of managing buildings is not something that's on the forefront of the minds of parents who are involved in these LCAP committees. And so I think there's a big learning curve, and my optimistic assumption is that this will improve over time. But still the point remains is that it was kind of left out of a lot of LCAPs. And I think that's something we need to look into. So go ahead. All right. So our policy question: can California districts adequately and equitably maintain and modernize their school facilities without state funding? And so what we do here is really look at these two issues: adequacy and equity. So adequacy is really defining what the needs are across the state, and how is that compared against actual spending? What is that gap? Is everyone above minimum? That would be great. If not, what is the gap? And then how does that gap look from an equity perspective? So in understanding these things, what we do is estimate minimum spending need, and Liz is going to describe how we do that. And so part of this study was to create a methodology to do that at a broad scale at a statewide level. And then we say, okay, how do we evaluate this state-local partnership? The school facility program is known as the state-local partnership in funding these facilities. Right now the state leg of that stool is non-existent, and so what does that mean going forward? But how has the state-local partnership been meeting the minimum spending needs? And from that, identify the policy reforms. And so the legislature will be taking up this discussion when they reconvene. The governor is supposedly going to put something in his budget this coming January, either around policy reforms or funding. And so there's an active discussion around this, and our hope is that this informs that discussion in a way that hasn't been done before, because this is actually a set of issues that has far too little research on it. The education field hasn't done an enormous amount on it. The infrastructure field hasn't. Building sciences haven't. It's kind of this in-between forgotten issue around education. I think that a lot of money is spent on, and it has a big impact on students and teachers. Next. Yeah. So let's jump into how we actually did this.
I'll stand too. So thanks, Jeff, for setting up kind of the broader context of why we're doing this research and the questions that were really driving our interest in digging into the data a little bit more. What I'm going to do is talk first about how we measure this benchmark, and then how we set up our methods for comparing the gap in terms of actual local spending relative to that benchmark for kind of meeting a basic set of minimum requirements. And so first I just want to take a quick detour and walk through some more detail on what facility spending actually is. So there's a couple different, here we have 6 different buckets of different purposes that districts direct facilities spending towards. So districts spend on facilities from 2 sources, and Jeff mentioned this already. They spend in their operating budgets, and they spend from their capital budgets. So operating budgets are that pool of money that goes to paying teacher salaries, textbooks, all of the kind of basic day-to-day running of the schools, and then the capital budget is kind of the debt-financed, more kind of construction-oriented side. So operating budget includes facilities operations, which is basically just the day-to-day management. It includes kind of the staff time, custodial services, just making sure that everything is in working order. It also includes routine maintenance, which are kind of small projects. So whether it's repairing parts on an air conditioner, kind of fixing furniture, fixing a hole, that kind of day-to-day maintenance. And then once you get into the capital budget, you start to see things that are more like what we call capital renewals, which are these sort of regular replacements of things that wear over time. So that's if you have to replace a roof because of regular decay over time. And then these other categories, so major modernization is kind of, you realize that your building is largely outdated or not aligned with kind of current standards of what's most educationally appropriate and most meets kind of needs for health and safety. So you'll kind of repair an entire wing or an entire large portion of a building. Obsolete building replacement is kind of the next step further down that line of realizing that instead of making these modernizations, we're going to just tear the whole thing down and start and build anew. And then new construction is more sort of construction oriented around enrollment growth or kind of new educational services being provided. So these are all of the different components of places where districts are going to be spending money on facilities. And we look specifically at these 3. We look at these primarily because this is kind of establishing a standard for minimum levels of investment in facilities. This is what you would have to invest in if there was no deferred maintenance, your facilities were in generally good repair, you saw no enrollment growth. These are the things you would have to invest in to make sure that you maintained a minimum standard of conditions for your students. And there's some industry benchmarks that we can use to estimate what's a good level of investment in each of these areas. And that's what you see on over on the side there with the 1%, 2%, 2% of CRV. And so what CRV is it's current replacement value. So the current replacement value of your assets is what it would take if you kind of just tore everything down and rebuilt it all again in the exact same state that it's in. So it's the cost of building all of your assets. And these are sort of some just general construction, like kind of industry-wide benchmarks about how much it costs to keep facilities in good repair. And I would note that these are pretty conservative estimates. So this is basically assuming that your 2% of maintenance assumes that your building's depreciating over the course of 50 years, which is a pretty long lifespan for a building. So the first thing we have to do now is figure out what does this actually mean in terms of an actual spending benchmark for a district to put in place in a meaningful way. And the first thing we have to do then is, well, what's the current replacement value of a district's assets? And this is actually a really hard question in California because of data issues. There's no kind of database on the current replacement value. There's not even really a database on the amount of like square footage in each district. So you can't just go somewhere and be like, oh, well, LAUSD has so and so many million square feet, and this is how much it would cost to keep that in good repair. So what we did was we had to estimate it. And the way that we did that was for each district, we looked at the total square feet, and we estimated square feet on a per student basis by looking at some recent construction data. So we looked at some recent state data on construction projects that had been finished in the past couple of years, and they had calculated per student averages for the square footage of those new projects. We assumed that was similar to what was in buildings that are in existence already. It might actually be a little bit conservative there too, since some older buildings have been more spacious than newer buildings. And then from there, we looked at, again, coming from these same kind of estimates of recent projects, what has been the cost per square foot of building those buildings. So we look at the cost per square foot times the total number of square feet, and we get our estimate of what the current replacement value is. So then looking across the whole state, that comes out to be about $200 billion statewide. So that's if you were to get rid of all the school buildings in California and rebuild them, it would cost you about $200 billion. So now we have our kind of sense of this is what a minimum need is, and I'll keep this off because it's government data collection and not the prettiest thing to look at. So we have this kind of estimate now of the total cost statewide, and then total costs in each district for what this is kind of a minimum level of investment, right? So it's important to remember that this is the absolute kind of like bare minimum standard of what a district needs to be doing to keep their facilities in good repair and in a steady state. So this doesn't include new construction of new classrooms, it doesn't include kind of modernizing a science lab, it's just the kind of base level of what it would take to meet really minimum standards. So once we have that, we can compare to actual district spending, are they meeting that standard? So what this is the survey of local government finances, and this is from NCES's Common Core of Data. And what this is it's a national data collection on all kinds of local governments, but this is kind of looking at school systems specifically, where the district will fill out this information on their past spending, submit it to the national system. It gets kind of standardized at the national level, and then we can use it for research purposes. So we focus on a couple lines of data in particular. The first being, it's probably really hard to read, especially from the back, but support services, operation, and maintenance of plant. And that aligns pretty closely to these first two up here, facility operations and routine maintenance. And for the rest of this talk, we're just going to refer to them as maintenance and operations. M&O. If we get really busy.
And then we go to the facility division and district.
And then the other piece that we look at is capital outlay expenditures. So capital outlay expenditures then is going to correspond. We're going to use it as a proxy for capital renewal, but this is another place where we're making a conservative estimate. That line actually basically covers everything in the capital budget side. So if a district is spending on new construction, that's also going to be coming out of capital outlay. But we do that because we want to know, are they at least meeting this basic level of minimum investment? And what we find is that in many cases they're not. So if they're not even meeting that basic level of minimum investment, the problem is actually likely much worse once you take into account that this is the same line of the budget that's being used for new investments in new construction as well. So what do we find when we look at both of these things together? When we look at the actual spending compared with this minimum level of investment that's needed? Yeah, sure. That'd be great. First, we find that districts are underspending in the aggregate on maintenance and operations. So less than half of districts throughout the state have met this benchmark level of 3% of CRV on maintenance and operations. We also find that less than half of districts are meeting the capital renewal spending. And again, that's particularly troubling given what the data on capital renewals actually is. So less than half of districts are even meeting a 2% level of investment on capital renewals. The other important thing is that these are oftentimes the same districts. So it's not necessarily that some districts are doing a really good job on maintenance and some districts are doing a really good job on building, and they're sort of spreading out the cost between those two activities. In 40% of districts, they're falling short on both measures at the same time. And it's also important to note that from the equity standpoint, these are a specific subset of districts. They're the ones that have the lowest property wealth, and I'll get into that in a lot more detail later. So again, districts with high property wealth. So AV stands for assessed valuation. So that's the total value of all property wealth in the district. So if you take up all the kind of buildings throughout, residential buildings, commercial buildings, and look at the value of those assets, that's kind of the base level that districts will use to determine the amount of property taxes that they collect. It also determines their ability to go out and bond to raise money through debt. And districts that have high property wealth, high assessed values, tend to spend more on construction in pretty dramatic ways. That's pretty intuitive, but it's worth noting.
So just to clarify, when you say that districts spend lower or higher, you mean as a percentage of their CRV or absolutely?
Per student, everything is, we'll show the data on it, but everything is on, we do everything at a per student level.
But it would be absolute for like dollars per student, not percentage of the.
Correct.
Yeah, so we're looking at dollars per student, but a lot of the counts are relative to the count will be relative to that benchmark level for the district.
Okay.
And just to note about how we're calculating spending, we looked at a period of time from 2008 to 2012, and we averaged across those 5 years because facility spending can be kind of inconsistent. You'll spend more in one year than you do in another year. And then we looked at a per student level to control for the fact that some districts are massive and some are tiny. Yeah. And so the final point is just that we look at property wealth, and then we also look at, because we care about the equity and we care about having buildings that are serving students in an equitable way across the state, we look specifically at districts that have a high percentage of low-income students, a high percentage of students receiving free and reduced price lunch. And what we find is that they're spending a lot of money on maintenance and operations, and they're spending a greater portion of their budget, of their facilities spending, is going to maintenance and operations rather than new construction and capital. And that places a pretty big burden on their general operating budget, which is where those funds come from. So to go into these in a little bit more detail and show you some of our data, going back to this first point that less than half of districts are meeting the maintenance and operations spending benchmark. What you see, these are the total count of districts in our sample. We have just under 900 districts that we're looking at. And 62% of those did not meet this 3% of CRV benchmark for maintenance. The difference then, in terms of actual average spending, winds up being, it's about $800 for the districts that are below the level, and $1,500 for districts that are above the level. So it's a pretty big difference between low spending districts and high spending districts in this area. Right. And then moving on to the second point, you also see a similar pattern. So nearly 60% of districts, about 500, are below benchmark on the capital side. And even here you see that the difference between the districts below benchmark and above benchmark is even more extreme. So while there appears to be kind of a floor on maintenance, there's sort of a minimum around $600, $700 that districts tend to spend per student. A lot of districts spend close to nothing on local capital. And the districts that do spend significantly more per student. So this is a difference of, $1,700, $1,800 per student. And then again, these are not different sets of schools, right? So you have 335 districts in California where they're below on both maintenance and capital. And then if you look at it here, you can see again these same kinds of differences in terms of a smaller but still substantial difference in terms of average maintenance and operations, and then this large gap in terms of local capital outlays. And what you see here, and you can see this through all of these charts, but this is a nice place to point it out, is that the difference between these are not two kind of random groups of districts. There are other important differences that make the districts that fall below benchmark different than the districts that are above benchmark. And one of the clearest differences is in this property wealth, this AV per student. So what you see is, 3 times as much assessed value per student in the districts that are meeting these benchmarks, that are meeting at least one of these benchmarks, as in the districts that are falling below on both. And you can also see, on the other hand, the average free and reduced price meals is more similar, but there's important differences in how they spend the money that we'll get to later. So what does this mean? Districts with high assessed values spend more per pupil. And I think this is clearest if you kind of look at the two ends of the spectrum, but you can see the pattern kind of throughout. What we did is we broke up our districts into quintiles, so evenly distributed buckets, to look more closely at how they were spending in each of the kind of different steps along the way in terms of the poorest districts in terms of property wealth, going all the way to the richest districts in terms of property wealth. And what you see is some pretty dramatic differences in both maintenance and operations, but then particularly in terms of capital outlay. So going from $500 per student to $2,000 per student. And then the other thing that you see, which is important to note, is that the percentage of breakdown of where they're spending their money also kind of flips. So in districts that don't have a lot of property wealth, you see kind of this small chunk of money being spent on capital outlays, and then a larger portion of the money going to maintenance. And then if you look down at the other end, it's flipped, so the green bar is higher than the blue bar. So a greater percentage of the money is going towards new construction rather than just kind of repairing and waiting for the next year to come along. And then the picture when you look at districts serving low-income students is a little bit more complex, but you see that same pattern that I'm just mentioning about how districts spend their money emerge. So if you look at, again, we broke it down into quintiles based on the percentage of students receiving free and reduced price lunch. So these are low poverty districts where students, with 0 to 31% of students receiving free and reduced price meals. And down at the other end, it's the kind of highest 20% of districts in terms of free and reduced price lunch. So 80 to 100% of students in the district getting free and reduced price meals. And in low poverty districts, what you see is that there's a little bit more money spent on capital rather than on maintenance. And if you look down at the other end of the district, what high poverty districts do, it's not necessarily that they're spending so much drastically less on facilities overall, but that less of that money is coming in the form of new construction and repairs, rather than just kind of, or in major repairs. So it's not like they're rebuilding the entire wing, they're maybe just fixing a new component or repairing a roof rather than doing kind of a major renovation of that system. And so this has some really important equity implications, right? Because what you get when you have maintenance instead of capital renewals is you're in older buildings, you're likely to have less repair, and you're also likely to have a greater burden put on the budgets in these schools, right? So the maintenance and operations comes out of the operating budget. So the more you're putting off long-term repairs because maybe you can't get the bond passed or for whatever reason you're not spending on the actual new facilities, you're instead spending on repairs that are competing with the teacher salaries, with textbooks, with all of the other things that are so important to running the school system day to day.
So the concern is going forward, if the state steps back from providing funding, what's going to happen over here in the higher poverty districts? Are these going to continue to go down? And if they do, it's likely going to push the operating spending higher, because the reality of the capital budget and the maintenance and operation budget is that they affect each other. There's not, the line that we drew earlier on between those categories is not as crisp as we might like it to be, right? There's a little bit of fuzzy gray area over that. Like if you were to spend, if you renovated a wing of a building or an entire building and you did capital renewals, that sort of lessens a little bit of your burden of your maintenance and operations, right? But what we think is actually happening is that often districts serving more low-income children are kind of undercapitalized, right? And so what they're being forced to do is then potentially do emergency repairs or other things out of the operating budget. And so there's not an even playing field because of the differences in assessed value in accessing capital side dollars, right? So there's a real difference across districts. And I think that, so we're really concerned that, a policy shift in this state-local partnership that increases reliance on local funds for facilities without addressing these disparities in ability to pay will exacerbate inequalities. And it's inconsistent with the shift that we've had in the LCFF towards a more equitable approach to funding across the board in education. So, all right, so the question is, what is the state going to do about this? And so what we describe in the paper and some of the other research that we've done on this is that really the state's the only entity out there that has the ability, and frankly it probably has the constitutional responsibility to level the playing field, right? And to make sure that all districts can meet their facilities needs with some combination of local funds and state funds, right? And the question is, how do they best do that? And what we came to based on the finding is, we didn't outline what a program could look like, because there's any number of ways that you could do that. You could, certainly identify a source out of the general fund, per se, right? And there's big questions about whether or not that should be in Prop 98, and of course people have very strong opinions on either side of that question. All the facility money, the capital side money has been outside of Prop 98 in the past. But really, there's four cornerstone reforms that the state needs to look at. One is that the state really, because so many districts are not meeting these minimal spending benchmarks, and this really poses a lot of risk for students, particularly on health and safety side, and those translate into student achievement. The state really needs to look at establishing some sort of stable and dedicated state funds for K-12 facilities. The question remains, is that going to go to all districts? Is it, as the governor has suggested, only going to be targeted to those very poor districts that kind of can't raise much money locally? That's open to debate. There seems to be competing visions of what that should be. So it'll be interesting to see what the legislative debate is on that next year. But then the second one is, whatever funds the state does come up with, they have to be distributed equitably. And I think taking a cue from the LCFF in terms of adjusting that per student grant or whatever it is by local wealth seems like the straightforward way to go, much like we do in the LCFF. And what we have found is across this country, the 23, 25 states out there do that. They adjust by local wealth. And it might be adjusting by assessed value, or it might be adjusting by the income of student families. And sometimes, some cases, it's both. But we should really look to that as part of the solution here in California, part of the different. The third one, improve standards for school facility planning and budgeting. Part of this whole story is that there hasn't been good, solid guidance on spending relative to needs, particularly on the adequacy side, right? So the state guideline has been that districts have to spend 3% of their general operating funds on their facilities. But what we've seen in the last handful of years is that the legislature allowed districts to basically flex that money, use it on other purposes during the recession. And the LAO, Legislative Analyst Office, has found that more than half of districts have flexed all or the majority of those funds. So this is a big problem if they're not safeguarded for facilities. But the difference between looking at, what we look at as a percent of the replacement value of buildings is actually a much more realistic standard than a percent of your operating budget, because there's not a clear connection between a district's operating budget and its facilities. There is a clear connection between percentage of the building's replacement value and those building needs, at least from kind of a high area. And then the last one is, to Liz's point multiple times, is that we have 1,000 school districts, we have 10,000 schools, we have 6 million kids sitting in these classrooms, and we actually don't know how much square footage we have. We don't know how old all of our buildings are. We don't know the conditions of them. Many districts do, like LAUSD, they have very good data on this, but many, many districts do not. And so that's why we have to use these kinds of techniques to do solid estimates of this. And what we were really focused on was kind of understanding the level of needs, because if the governor and the legislature and others never really understand the need, they'll never set up a remedy that truly addresses the need, right? Because as we showed earlier, we spent billions and billions of dollars on this, and there's still more need. We know there's lots of buildings that are in very poor condition. And so this is an ongoing responsibility that I think kind of falls under the radar from an education policy perspective. Even though you'll see it in local schools, local newspapers a lot about issues in individual districts, but in terms of really having statewide knowledge, we're really somewhat flying blind. And so our research has been trying to take off the blinders on that. So we'd love to hear your comments. You know, it's sort of we were kind of surprised at the level of underspending. But when we show this and talk to school districts across the state and people that work on this in Sacramento, they actually weren't that surprised. So the question is, what do we do as a state about this? Because it's an expensive responsibility, just stewardship, responsible ownership of these buildings that our kids sit in and our teachers sit in and administrators sit in every single day. So, final comment?
No, it seems like it's good.
All right, good. So questions, comments? Yeah.
When you're making estimates about square footage and then correlated with, I'm sorry, I'm blanking right now. What else did you correlate the square footage with? Was it the amount spent on students, or was the?
In calculating the current replacement
Yeah,
value?
exactly.
Yeah. So what we did is we took the typical amount of square footage per student and then multiplied it by the typical cost of replacing a square foot of a school building.
Okay.
And both of those were based off of recent estimates from Office of School Construction at the state level, which maintains data on not every construction project that's ever happened in California, but recent ones. And so we kind of took some analysis that they had done that calculated averages, actually averages at elementary, middle, and high school levels for both of those things. And then used the elementary and middle and high school enrollment levels across the state and in each district to calculate out an estimate.
So it's basically like 85 to 100 square feet per student is roughly what the schools across the state have, give or take. And then we used a replacement construction value of $400 a square foot.
And that just looks at buildings, right? It doesn't look at acreage or square footage of like
Right.
playing fields or like
That's right.
swimming facilities or anything.
It assumes they already own the land.
Okay.
It's like if they could rebuild on that side.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And of course, construction costs go up and down. 400 seems reasonable this day and age. Did you have a question back there?
I was wondering if another contributing factor to them not rebuilding or fully refurbishing buildings was time, because it tends to lately take longer to reconstruct a school in California because of state logistics and construction error and board member logistics, that this time costs more money, therefore there is no money.
I don't know if that would be a reason for them not doing it, but it definitely is. Well, those things that you mentioned are something that greatly affect school renovation and school construction in the state, and there's lots of concern and complaint about, you know, the state bureaucracy, the time that it takes to get approvals, because there's a whole set of approvals that the state has to give. There's a seismic approval, you know, that the building's not going to fall down in an earthquake. There's education standards in Title V of the California Code of Regulations in terms of square footage per student and kind of the educational and safety features within those buildings. So districts have to do a lot to meet those, you know, and there's kind of a debate as to whether or not the state should require those things, but I think it's hard. I would be very surprised if the state would step back on those kinds of requirements based on their responsibility for the health and education of children and safety of children. Those things are huge in terms of affecting the time and cost of school construction, or can be on certain projects, certainly. And there's been a long conversation in Sacramento about streamlining the whole process, and actually since 1998, when the school construction program was kind of set up as we know it now, I mean, there's been a lot of streamlining, let's just say, that has tried to make things a lot smoother and less complicated. And is it as simple and streamlined as it could be? I'm not quite sure, but on the other side, I think that school buildings and making sure they're right is actually a complicated affair. I would be a little wary of too much simplification across the board, but the issues you raise are huge in this policy conversation about what's the appropriate state role. Yeah.
I was wondering if, like, in your calculation, like, I know lots of schools use like portables and temporary things and things like that. How did those work into your calculation?
So we did not, I mean, well, here's another issue. We have no idea how many portables exist in the state of California.
Yeah.
The previous study that we did a couple of years ago, we estimated, what'd you say?
What were you gonna say?
What were you gonna say?
I was thinking around 7.
I was thinking it was 7,500.
Yeah,
I could look it
sorry,
up.
7,500.
Yeah, we don't know how many portables we have, but you know, a couple of studies have been done on indoor air quality in those portables and other issues. It's like they have found really, you know, a lot of concern in those. You know, the portables issue is a complicated one because, you know, school districts need to kind of weather these long-term, you know, enrollment fluctuations, right? And so portables were set up to be that kind of flexibility for them without having to build a whole new wing or something, right? And then it's empty when all those kids matriculate up to middle and high school, you know, if it's not a steady. And so this has been a long concern. So we don't know how many there are. We focused on school facilities, the ones that have foundations, solid foundations.
Don't roll away.
Wouldn't your assumptions concerning enrollment translated to square footage would be inclusive of portables because many of those students are being housed in portable buildings?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely true, and I think most districts probably are reporting their spending on
Right,
portables
that's true.
in the exact same way that they're reporting their spending on other aspects of their facilities. So construction of portables is probably going into the capital reporting, and then maintenance of portables is going into that maintenance line.
Yeah, so this would include portables. I mean, you know, and that's been there's a handful of folks in the legislature that have wanted to get rid of portables, and there's been some debate about that. Right, does the state fund portables right now?
They do not, and actually had a pretty extensive program in the last round of funding to incentivize districts to demolish their portables and build up, particularly in urban areas, so that they could recapture the land for you know, blacktops and soccer fields and other things, because oftentimes the portables got located there as an afterthought and it removed space for facilities to operate in. So there's an incentive program to delete those and build up, and it was extremely popular, it was extremely used, it was a really good policy, I think. So we know that some have been eliminated, but we also heard that once they built their 2-story building, they wanted to keep the portables, you know, because they might want to put something else out there or a program that they want to operate at their school that they didn't have room for. And so, but the program, one of the tenets was you had to demolish it, but we know that they didn't always do that. But there have been thoughts of that, and there was a time in policy in California where we said you must build 30% of your school in portable buildings. So all these schools that you see that were built in the 70s and 80s all had portable buildings on them, with the thought that when the population would tend to decrease in a neighborhood, you could move those buildings out somewhere else or demolish them and use the core facility as a core facility. But what we found, it was a failed policy, because what we found was those portable buildings never left. They're 40, 50 years old. They were never intended for that kind of length of use. And so now we have a portable problem, and we have an indoor air quality problem. And so the state in 1998 went away from saying you must build 30% of your buildings as portables, and all of those buildings built since then, all schools built since then, have usually not had portables, and only they've been used when you have overcrowding situations or they're old.
So I should introduce Catherine Moore. She has been a collaborator and friend for many years, but she just recently stepped down from 10 years running the California Department of Education's school facility and transportation program. And then for most of those years sat on the allocation board that hands out the school construction dollars, that has legislators and governor appointees on it, and so has been very immersed in these. And before that, was doing facilities at Elk Grove Unified in the Sacramento area, which at that time in the late 90s, early 2000s was one of the fastest growing districts in the country and built dozens of new schools. So it's been in the thick of this, but it's been a real champion for the education standards around those, like the program-related standards around design and as they relate to program and delivery, which is not an easy thing to be a champion for because folks are focused on the construction and the dollars and the costs and the things that you mentioned right there. But I think all of this is around like this real question about what is the state role. We all went to schools, we kind of know, some of us probably went to schools that were pretty decent, some of us went to schools that probably had a lot of portables, and some of them were fine, and some of them were probably not so fine. But I think we have enough anecdotal evidence to suggest that there's a lot of schools out there that have really poor facility conditions, and we haven't met that responsibility to at least provide bare minimum conditions related to issues of health and safety. Let alone the issues of does it have the science labs to meet the curriculum? Does it have these other design aspects that really promote the curriculum? Which of course is always changing. Buildings don't change that fast, right? So, any other comments, questions? Yeah.
So it sounds like from your analysis, you can now generate a list of districts that you think are underspending. Is that true?
Yeah. I mean, we certainly have those districts.
And
But we know the list.
And have you gone to any of these schools to actually see what it looks like? To see what do these numbers actually, how do they play out?
Yeah, I think, no, we've gone to some of them. I mean,
Well, obviously you don't
because
know
I've gone
all
to
of
some
them.
of them. But no, I think I would love actually to be proven wrong. I would love all the districts across the state to step forward with conditions assessments and very detailed budgets of what they've been spending. I would love to be proven wrong here, and that the picture is much better than what we have found. I don't think that's the case, and I think we have enough evidence to suggest that. I think, because we're doing estimating, we're estimating square footages. We cross-checked it with a handful of districts, and some of them we were above, and some of them we were below. But in terms of the aggregate state level, we feel that it evens out. So once you start getting down to individual districts, it gets a little, less precise, shall we say? So I think that's. Do you want to add to that?
No,
But I think it's a big issue.
Yeah, I would agree that while this process results in a list of districts that are kind of above and below, I think the data are most powerful in the aggregate, especially because of all these issues of, we're estimating different things, we're looking at, past spending data over a period of 5 years, which tells you a lot, but it doesn't tell you everything about facilities investment. So there may be some districts that are, below the line and should be above, and some that are above and should be below, if you actually are going in and drilling down to their actual square footage, their actual spending data from their budget. But I think the scale of how many districts fall below in all of these categories and fall below on such a conservative estimate of need should give state and local policymakers considerable pause. And I think at least warrants going in and figuring out which districts really are below.
And I think that was, I don't doubt any of this. I was just, I was asking just because I'm thinking that if you're trying to make this point of this is a huge problem, if it would be any more effective to bring in those case studies or to bring in those actual examples so that is when somebody, you can see the numbers and but then to actually see a school and experience that, I think is pretty powerful.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that would be a great follow-up to this, is to take some districts across that spectrum of spending on both, and kind of do visual case studies of what their facilities are like, what their learning conditions are like.
Have you checked it out on Google Maps and stuff? So I feel like that's
Not yet, you could.
That's
it
could be a first step into exploring. I mean, at least virtually, but I feel like it kind of gives you
right. No,
It's a little hard to see condition on Google Maps.
Right.
Because it's used all the time. Districts use that, and before there was Google Maps, like the district I worked in, we flew the sites every year, so, and took pictures from the air.
Right.
And you really, so you knew what your facility, you know, looked like, and we were mainly because we were moving portables all over the place, so we could know where those portables were year to year and how it looked for the site, but.
Google Maps ruined that fun.
Yeah, then so that guy went out of business.
Right.
He's retired and doing something else.
No, I think that, I mean, these are good questions because I think that these would be great projects for people to do, if any of you are interested in this. Because it's really, there's, you know, we have a lot of square footage across the state. I mean, we have a lot of schools, and we don't have a lot of analysis of them at all. And I think, you know, there's a real gap there in understanding. And I think without that understanding, I think that's what enables the legislature and other state leaders to kind of not address the problem, right? Because one of our recommendations is for a database of facilities, and we think that in the LCAP, districts should really be should do a better job of reporting their conditions. And there's a lot of problems with, in my opinion, with the current requirements around that, which are pretty minimal in my opinion. But there's been enormous resistance to that for many, many years because I think that there's concern in Sacramento about what it would reveal. And then all of a sudden you've documented a big problem that the state's responsible for, potentially. So it's, I don't know if it's a sort of a head in the sand kind of approach, but I think you see these patterns of underinvestment. The thing with it is you don't spend on your building, it compounds, right? The problem doesn't just go away. We didn't fix the roof leak this year, we didn't replace the boiler or whatever. It doesn't just sort of go, well, maybe we'll do it next year. It's like, no, those things compound. It's not unlike with a car or, if you don't replace your spark plug or replace your oil and stuff, right? That's going to turn into a much bigger problem not too far down the road. Or if you don't replace the chain on your bike, right? Since we're perfect. I mean, so these issues compound, and so they're easy to defer. And you talk to most districts, they have long deferred maintenance lists. They're very easy to defer because they usually don't have parent advocates and others. You don't see the result of it for a number of months or more, right? Which makes them easier to kind of push downstream.
So to what degree do your numbers let you break down costs that could be paid now and might be manageable, but that compounding, if we leave this for a year, for 10 years, how much worse will it be?
Well, that's a good question. We don't know that number. There are probably rules of thumb that the building industry might use to come up with that. But basically what we found, like being very conservative, is all the districts that fell below the gap on both of those, there would need to be an extra about $1.5 billion at least spent every year just to bring those districts up to that minimum level on both capital and the capital side and the M&O side. So that's one, but that's at minimum, right? So an additional $1.5 billion or more to do that.
And I think that dynamic too also helps get at some of the charts we saw with low wealth districts and high poverty districts, where you see those low levels of spending on capital and much higher levels of spending on maintenance. It may be that there are greater maintenance needs in low wealth or high poverty districts, but what it sort of suggests is that there's been this kind of delay or lack of spending on the capital side, and then this accumulation of maintenance needs year over year over year.
Do you have access to older data? So you said that you looked at 5 years period?
Yeah, we looked a little bit at data starting from 1998. The survey goes back, I think, reasonably even further than that. We looked a little bit at data going from 1998 all the way up to 2012. 2012 is the most recent year of data that we have. There's a pretty long lag. I assume 2013 is coming out soon, but and if you look at there, you see pretty similar trends in terms of the types of districts that are falling below. I think some districts have gotten worse in terms of capital spending. I think that might have a lot to do with the recession. It might also have a lot to do with the fact that there's been less state support in the past 5 years than there was between 1988 and 2008. But yeah, you see the same kinds of trends in terms of there are some districts that are above, there's some districts that are below. High wealth districts tend to be spending above benchmark levels, and high poverty districts tend to be spending more on maintenance. That all kind of holds up throughout that full 15-year period.
And I think that it's not necessarily, I think, our role with this to kind of identify the individual districts that are falling below, but it's really, as I said, it's looking at the scale and how falling below. Really kind of providing the support for a serious conversation in Sacramento about how do we try to address adequacy, right, and equity. I mean, as you know, in broader education funding, we've made great movement towards the being more equitable. We certainly haven't addressed the adequacy side in terms of just funding education enough relative to needs. And what's different about one thing that's kind of interesting on the building side of it is you actually can be a little more precise about how much money buildings need. It's hard to actually know how much money schools need to operate per student, right? Because you could always have more education programs that might do more educationally, right? It's arguably it could be more of an exact science on the facility side, but we haven't addressed it. And I think as the state revisits what its role is going to be on the funding side, at least we have some better information about, can districts go it alone? And really what we found is that based on their recent year spending, a lot of them probably cannot.
Okay. I was wondering if you have any sense for what the appearance of charter schools does to these numbers. Just more buildings. I don't know. Children going more.
Charters are interesting. Yeah. I mean, we don't isolate out charters or anything. Yeah. In the last 2 school construction bonds, there has been a carve out of those monies for charters. Not an enormous amount of money. I forget. 500 million in each one. Yeah, that's right. Charters are really unique, and I think that here's an area that needs a lot more research on, is what charters are doing with their facilities. I know that charters are occupying empty or closed down regular public schools buildings or wings sometimes. They're operating in buildings that were never designed to be charters. So you have a lot of things going on. And you have some charters that are building new buildings, although I don't think that's the norm. But it does seem to me that there's much more interest. I know that facilities are a huge challenge for charters. Finding spaces, finding adequate, decent sized spaces is really hard in some communities. So if you need a research project, there's an enormous amount of work to be done on that. I know the Charter School Association has done a recent report or 2 on facilities needs, trying to quantify that. And they've certainly been advocating for the state to provide funding to charters for facilities. And we're at almost 10% of our students are in charters now. Yeah. That's a good question.
And growing.
And growing.
Which, I mean, if you're thinking about our estimates, which are all just, again, calculated on a per student basis, that comes out to $20 billion worth of facilities. If you're just going to say, 10% of students, if they're taking up 10% of the space, they're also probably taking up 10% of the current replacement value. So you can start to get a sense just from the enrollment. We do see a similar kind of calculation to what we've done.
All right.
I'm just wondering if the sort of programs that you describe are going to be put in place, if the state is going to acknowledge its role here, what will it take? Will the people in Sacramento simply wake up some morning and say, yes, this is a good idea? Will it be more data? Will it be something else? Do you have any sense about that?
I think it's a number of things. Kathleen can probably weigh in on that as well. I mean, I think that there's a lot of members in the legislature that definitely support state funds for school construction. I mean, their localities want to see those funds, and last year there was a bill for new funding. It eventually was killed in the floor of the legislature. And the governor's resistance has been two things mainly, one of which he came into office saying he was going to reduce the state's debt, right? Statewide school construction bonds add to the state's debt, right? So he has not been wanting to do that now. And he has also said that the current program is inequitable, or has inequities in it. It needs to be more equitable. And I think that I would agree with him certainly on the latter, about the state could spend its money more equitably. Having a sliding scale or something akin to the way in which the per pupil grants are for LCFF is a way to do that. But the question is the state going to provide these monies to all districts? Is it going to be competitive? Is it going to be reserved for districts? Is it only going to go to some of the very low wealth districts? I mean, some of that depends on how much money the state, if you only had a small amount of money that the legislature came up with, you might devise one program. If you had a larger bucket of funds, you might devise another program. That's why this sort of gets a little tricky to formulate. But I think too is the public will behind it. School construction bonds have been very popular. They've almost all passed. Very few don't pass locally. Every election cycle there's one. So there is right now a bond that has got enough signatures to qualify for the November 16 ballot. It's done by a coalition of school districts and builders and architects, and known as the Coalition for Adequate School Housing and the Building Industry Association. They want to put a $9 billion school construction bond on. It basically keeps the exact same program as it was. But what will be really fascinating is that if assuming that moves forward, is it will be on the November 2016 ballot. All of us in California will vote yes or no on that, whether we want to tax ourselves for school construction. What will also be on that ballot is the re-up for Prop 30, right, for the LCFF funds. So those are two major taxes for public education on the same ballot. And I know there's a lot of concern in Sacramento about will those be competing, will one beat out the other? Will the school construction bond beat out re-upping Prop 30 or vice versa? Where will the alliances form kind of politically across the state and in Sacramento? I think is going to be really fascinating. Remains to be seen. We need both. I don't know where we get the money. That's the trick. Is what rocks do you look under to find the money to fund public education in California? So that's a big question. All right. Well, thanks. So here's our URL. If you guys, we've done a number of studies on school facility related issues and some of the other stuff that I talked about earlier. But